Well, it's a move that's turned even the most loyal unionists against Premier Daniel Andrews. This election, the United Firefighters Union has been campaigning against the Premier. You remember they were instrumental in getting first elected back in 2014. Tonight in my documentary, you'll hear from Peter Marshall, the powerful boss of the UFU, United Firefighters Union, who has described how he and the Victorian firefighters feel betrayed by the Victorian Labor government.
How do you come to terms with the fact that you're being betrayed by the government that says they supported firefighters, the very government that you stood by in 2014, the very government that you protect their family while they're in parliaments?
When firefighters attend a fire, they're exposed to dangerous chemicals that, when they become burnt, become airborne carcinogens. Now, these carcinogens, or chemicals that cause cancer, enter their bodies. They end up with cancer. It can't be avoided, it can't be minimised. So there was a special compensation scheme set up a few years ago to provide for them should the worst happen to them and their families. And it's this scheme that the Victorian Premier has now upended. Now, the history here is important. And two men who know it better than anyone else are former Liberal senators, Chris Back from WA and Eric Abetz from Tasmania. In the Gillard government back in 2011, both of these senators, former senators, were members of a special Senate committee that looked into the issue of firefighter cancer and ultimately supported that Australia adopt an internationally proven model to give firefighters fairness, the same model that's now at threat in Victoria. Both men join me tonight here on Credlin. Chris Back, Eric Abetz, thank you. I thought, given the fact I was speaking tonight in my documentary with Peter Marshall, I hear from firefighters firsthand at the betrayal and the anger they have towards the Premier, that we might put some background around this. Chris Back, you heard from experts that firefighters have a cancer risk like no other occupation, didn't you? Help us understand it a little more.
Yeah, certainly, Peter. Peter Marshall came to us in 2011. Senator Gavin Marshall was the chair of the Workplace Relations Committee, of which I was deputy chair. And Peter Marshall put to us the view that if a firefighter was injured in a fire scene on the way to or from, they got compensation. But if they were now dying of a cancer that they may have actually picked up as a result of a carcinogen at a fire some years earlier, if they couldn't prove which fire it was, and they couldn't prove which carcinogen it was, they had no compensation. Clearly, we looked at this. They requested that we look at 7 cancers that medicine was accepting. And my first reaction, I went to Eric Abetz, my leader at the time, and said to him, you know, this could possibly be an issue associated with an increased request for workers' compensation. I convinced him that it wasn't. I went to Tony Abbott at his direction, got Tony's agreement. And what was interesting about it, of course, Peter, was that it did not add to the capacity of compensation for the firefighter, be they volunteer or career, and neither did it add to the burden of responsibility for the employer. All it did do was to say that in the event that this person has now suffering from or looking like dying of a cancer, which medicine would regard as having been caused by that carcinogen from a burning fire, then he should deserve compensation. What Peter Marshall did was interesting. In the very room where we had our first hearing in Canberra, they did a flammability study before the meeting started. And once we got underway, he pointed out all the elements within that room that if the building was on fire, the chemicals that are inert, totally safe when they were as we were, would actually be carcinogenic in the event of a fire. As a result of our concerns about workers' compensation, etc., in fact, the Chief Officer of the Canadian Fire Service in Manitoba came to Australia at the direction of his minister, and we put to him this question about, was there an increase in demands for compensation? And he told us 2 things, Peter. He said, first of all, medicine in Canada recognised 14 cancers, but secondly, he said there'd actually been a reduction in workers' compensation claims on a per-hour work basis, and it was simply because firefighters had come to understand the severity and the risk and the danger, and they had actually changed and improved their own behaviours. So it was on that basis that we took this forward to the Senate. 13 of those 14 we put forward and actually were accepted by the Australian Parliament. and very proud to say it's the first legislation anywhere in the world that actually recognised the fact that a firefighter who actually had been in a fire, had picked up carcinogens as a result of his presence in that fire, was now entitled to that compensation.